They said she was just a simple woman, someone who never raised her voice, never tried to draw attention, never fought back even when people around her laughed at her or whispered behind her back. In the small town where gossip traveled faster than the wind, she became an easy target. Her clothes were plain, her shoes were worn, and her hands were always marked with the roughness of work that others considered beneath them. When she walked to the market, balancing a small basket with vegetables or carrying water from the communal pump, people smirked, nudged one another and sometimes even called out cruel names. She lowered her eyes not because she was ashamed, but because she knew there was no use arguing with people who had already decided she was beneath them. They thought her silence was weakness, they thought her bowed head was submission, and they thought her stillness meant they could go further, humiliating her in ways that would have broken many others. But what they did not know was that silence can be heavier than thunder, and humility can hide storms inside it, waiting for the right moment to erupt. The day that moment arrived, no one in the village would ever forget. It began like any other morning, with the sun spilling golden light over the clay houses and the smell of bread baking in distant kitchens. She had come early to the square, carrying a small bundle of herbs she hoped to sell. Her life depended on small earnings like these, yet even that became an excuse for mockery. A group of young men, emboldened by the crowd that gathered daily in the market, began circling her stall, snickering loudly. One of them snatched the herbs from her hands, tossing them into the dust as if they were nothing. Another one mocked her accent, pretending to stumble over his words as the others laughed. She stood still, her face calm, her eyes fixed on the ground. They grew louder, louder still, craving the attention of others, craving her reaction. Then a woman from the crowd shouted that she should be stripped of her shawl, because surely she had nothing worth protecting beneath it. The cruelty of the suggestion sent ripples of laughter through the onlookers, and before she could step back, two of the boys yanked at her thin scarf and pulled it off her shoulders. Gasps followed. At first, the crowd expected her to cry or to beg for mercy, but she did neither. She stood straighter than anyone had ever seen her stand before, and the morning light struck her back, revealing marks that silenced every mouth instantly. Long, deep scars crossed her skin like rivers carved in stone, layered upon each other, some faded with time, others still fresh with pain. They were not the marks of accidents, not the kind one earns through daily labor. They were deliberate, brutal, inflicted by someone who knew how to cause suffering. The crowd stared, wide-eyed, as the laughter died in their throats. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant cry of a crow. Even the young men who had humiliated her stepped back, their faces pale, their hands trembling as if they had touched something forbidden. People began whispering, this time not with mockery but with fear. Who could have done this to her? Why had she never spoken of it? What story lay hidden in those scars that now shone like burning truth under the morning sun? She remained silent, but her silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of power, the kind that forces people to look inward, ashamed of what they had done, ashamed of their cruelty. She slowly bent down, picked up the herbs scattered in the dust, brushed them clean with steady fingers, and placed them back in her basket. Not once did she glance at the ones who had tried to humiliate her. They were already defeated, though she had not spoken a single word. The marks on her back had spoken louder than any argument could. In that moment, the simple woman they thought they could trample upon became someone untouchable, someone they could no longer laugh at, someone whose pain carried weight heavier than their laughter could ever lift. People began to move away, embarrassed, ashamed, unable to face her. Some muttered apologies under their breath, others simply fled the scene. Only the young men remained frozen in place, realizing that the cruelty they thought would make them look strong had exposed their own weakness. She tied her scarf back around her shoulders, adjusted her basket, and walked away without a word, leaving behind a crowd that would never look at her the same way again. For years to come, they would speak of that day in hushed tones, of the scars that stunned them all, and of the simple woman who carried storms carved into her flesh yet never let them destroy her spirit. After that day, the air in the village shifted, though no one openly admitted it. People who once jeered when she walked past now lowered their eyes in shame, as if meeting her gaze would expose their guilt. The young men who had been at the center of the humiliation avoided the marketplace entirely for weeks, pretending to be ill or occupied with chores, but everyone knew it was fear that kept them away. The woman, however, remained unchanged in her routine. Each morning she rose before dawn, carried her basket of herbs and vegetables to the square, sold whatever little she could, and returned to her small home by the edge of the fields. Yet even in her silence she carried an unspoken strength, and everyone who saw her felt it, though none dared speak of it. Still, whispers found their way through cracks, spreading from one house to another. Some said the scars were from a violent husband long gone, others murmured that she had been imprisoned once, punished by men in power for reasons no one could fully explain. There were darker tales too, spun by those who feared what they did not understand, that she was cursed, that she had made a bargain with forces unseen and the marks were proof of divine wrath. These rumors did not trouble her, for she had long learned that people will invent their own truths when the real one is too heavy to face. Yet what no one knew was that behind the silence of her days, she carried memories that still bled like open wounds in her nights. When the lamps went out and the village slept, she lay awake, remembering the chains that once cut into her wrists, the cold stone walls of the place where she had been kept, the blows that rained down until her back tore open, and the screams that no one came to hear. She had not been cursed, nor had she been punished for crime but for defiance. Long ago, in a time the village had forgotten, soldiers had stormed her town, taking men for war and women for servitude. She had been young then, with fire in her eyes and words that challenged the authority of men who carried weapons. She had refused to bow, refused to give them the obedience they demanded. For that, they had dragged her away, beaten her until her body was marked forever, and thrown her into darkness, believing they had broken her. But when the war passed and the soldiers moved on, she crawled out of the ruins of their cruelty, carrying with her the marks of their violence and the silence of her survival. No one had asked her story when she returned to the village years later. No one had offered to help. People only whispered about her changed eyes, the way she no longer laughed, the way her body bore shadows of pain. And so she lived quietly, making herself smaller so as not to attract more harm. But scars do not remain silent forever, and on that day in the market, when the shawl was ripped from her shoulders, the truth carved into her flesh spoke for her. Now the village could not ignore it, though they still did not dare ask. They treated her with caution, half respect, half fear, as though she had become something beyond ordinary, as though the suffering written on her skin had elevated her into a figure they could no longer mock. Some mothers warned their children not to stare, others whispered prayers when she passed, unsure if she carried blessing or curse. And yet, deep inside her, something had begun to change. For the first time in years she did not feel invisible. The shame they had tried to pour upon her had slipped away, replaced by a strange power she had not expected. She began to walk differently, her back straighter, her steps steady as if each movement declared her survival. And though she spoke little, the silence was no longer one of fear but of command, as if she knew she could summon storms without uttering a single word. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, one of the same young men who had tried to strip her shawl came to her door. He stood trembling, his eyes unable to meet hers, his voice breaking as he stammered out an apology. He confessed that he had thought it would be nothing more than a cruel joke, that he had never imagined what lay beneath. He begged for forgiveness, his hands shaking, his breath uneven. She looked at him for a long time, her eyes heavy with memories he could never carry. Then she said nothing, only closed the door slowly in his face. For forgiveness was not hers to give, it was something he would have to wrestle with in his own soul. She returned to her table, lit a small lamp, and sat in the quiet, her scars burning with memory yet also glowing with defiance. For years she had lived thinking her suffering was a secret burden, but now it had become something else, a mirror that forced others to confront themselves. And though she remained outwardly simple, selling herbs and wearing plain clothes, inside her a new strength had awakened, one that the village could feel though they could not name. Days turned into weeks, and though the village slowly returned to its usual rhythms, the memory of that morning in the marketplace never left their minds. Every time she passed, people felt the weight of her silence and the image of the scars etched into her back. The whispers had quieted somewhat, no longer filled with ridicule but with a kind of uneasy reverence. Children who once mocked her now ran out of her way, and women who once sneered at her plain clothes now pulled their shawls tighter when she walked by, as if trying to shield themselves from unseen judgment. Yet for her, life continued as it always had. She tended her herbs, sold what she could, cooked her simple meals and kept to herself. But inside her, a restless stirring had begun to take root. It was not anger nor pride but something else, an awakening she could not name. For so long she had been silent because she believed no one would ever understand, but now she wondered whether her silence had been protecting them more than herself. Because if they knew the full truth of what she had endured, their world would never again be as small and simple as they liked it to be. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars blinked awake, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find an old woman from the far end of the village, her face wrinkled like dried fruit, her eyes sharp and searching. The old woman did not ask permission but stepped inside as if she belonged there, lowering herself onto the floor with surprising ease. She looked at her long and hard before speaking. "Child," she said, though her own hair was white with age, "the scars on your back are not just your story. They're ours too. Do not hide them." The words stunned her, for no one had dared to speak openly since that day. She sat across from the old woman, silent, waiting. The woman told her of her own past, how she had been taken once, beaten, left with wounds that had healed into marks that only age had since erased. She said many women carried scars, though hidden under clothes and silence, and that seeing hers had woken something in all of them. "You think your suffering was only yours," the old woman whispered, "but it was a mirror of all of ours. They mocked you because they feared being reminded of their own pain. Now that they have seen it, they cannot unsee it." The simple woman lowered her eyes, her heart heavy with memory, but the old woman reached forward and touched her hand. "You survived," she said firmly, "and that survival is power. Use it." Those words echoed in her mind long after the old woman left, haunting her through the night as she lay awake listening to the wind. "Use it," the voice repeated, "use it." But how could she? She had no wealth, no family, no influence. All she had were scars and silence. Yet in the days that followed, she began to notice the way other women in the village looked at her. Their eyes lingered, not with mockery but with recognition. Some even offered small nods, subtle signs of respect. It was as if her scars had spoken for them too, given shape to the voices they had swallowed for years. One afternoon, while she was selling herbs, a young girl approached her, barely 10 years old, clutching a torn piece of cloth in her small hands. The girl's eyes were wet with unshed tears, her lips trembling as she whispered that her father had struck her again. The simple woman froze, staring at the child, and in that instant the memories of her own suffering came flooding back. For the first time she placed her basket aside, knelt to meet the child's eyes and gently took her hand. She did not speak many words, only said softly, "You are not alone." The child looked at her with wide eyes, and though her body still trembled, a small spark of relief flickered in her gaze. That moment planted a seed inside the simple woman. Perhaps her survival was not meant to remain locked in silence. Perhaps it was meant to shield others, to break the circle of cruelty before it carved new scars on new backs. She began to notice more and more of them. Women with bruises hastily covered, girls with eyes too old for their young faces, even men who carried the quiet shame of being broken in ways society did not allow them to admit. They began to come to her, some with words, some only with heavy silence, but all seeking something they could not name. And without realizing it, she began to give it to them. Sometimes it was only a steady gaze that told them they were seen, sometimes it was a whispered assurance that pain could be endured, and sometimes it was the reminder that survival itself was a form of defiance. Slowly, the simple woman who had once been mocked for her silence became a quiet center in the village, a place where others came when they had nowhere else to go. She still sold her herbs, still wore plain clothes, still lived in her small home, but the air around her changed. No longer was she just a figure of pity or ridicule. She became something else entirely, something that unsettled and yet drew people in. A reminder that scars, though carved by cruelty, could also mark strength. And though she did not yet know what path this awakening would lead her to, she felt, for the first time in years, that her pain might not have been in vain. The season began to change, and with it the rhythms of the village. Harvest drew near, fields filled with workers, and the air was heavy with both exhaustion and anticipation. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary life, something else was shifting, something invisible but powerful. The simple woman, once a shadow at the edges of the market, had become a quiet force that people could no longer ignore. It was not through loud speeches or bold actions but through presence itself, through the way others had begun to gather near her when they needed courage, through the way her silence steadied them when their own voices shook. More and more women came to her door at night, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, whispering about their sorrows, their bruises, their losses. She never asked for details, never demanded explanations, but listened with an attentiveness that made them feel as though their suffering was not only heard but shared. Word spread, and soon her small home at the edge of the fields became a sanctuary where unspoken truths finally found breath. One evening, a young mother came with her baby clutched tightly in her arms, eyes red from weeping. She confessed that her husband had been drinking away their meager savings, leaving them hungry and vulnerable. The woman did not scold her, did not offer false comfort. Instead, she guided her inside, fed her warm bread, and allowed her to rest while the baby slept. "In the quiet," she said gently, "the marks of cruelty are not always carved into flesh. Sometimes they live in hunger, in fear, in the silence we are forced to swallow. But survival is a mark too, and it can be stronger than pain. The young mother cried, but in her tears there was relief, and when she left, she carried with her a new sense of resolve. These moments multiplied, until the simple woman realized that she was no longer merely a survivor of her own scars. She had become a vessel for others' strength. The men of the village began to notice the change as well, and not all were comfortable with it. Some muttered that she was filling the women's heads with dangerous ideas, that too much talk of pain and survival would lead to rebellion against the order of things. Others warned their wives and daughters to stay away from her, but their words only drove more of them to her doorstep, drawn by the need to share what they had buried for so long. The young men who had once mocked her kept their distance, still ashamed, yet they too felt the pull of her presence. A few even lingered near the market when she was there, not daring to approach but listening, as if waiting for a chance to understand what they had once dismissed. But not all eyes looked upon her with kindness. The village headman, a man whose authority rested on tradition and fear, began to grow uneasy. He had heard the whispers, seen the way women gathered, noticed the shift in the air whenever her name was spoken. He feared what might come if the people began to draw strength from her instead of bending under his will. One night, under the flicker of an oil lamp, he spoke with a group of men, insisting that the scars on her back were signs of dishonor, that she was a cursed woman bringing unrest to their homes. He wanted her silence restored, not through shame this time but through fear. Yet though his words carried weight, they also revealed his unease, and those who listened could sense that he was threatened by her strength. The woman herself sensed the tension rising, though she did not let it deter her. She had lived through worse storms than this, and fear no longer bound her as it once did. Still she understood the danger. Power, even the quiet power of survival, always unsettled those who thrived on control. And so she moved carefully, speaking little, offering shelter and listening more than advising, ensuring that her role remained one of quiet support rather than open defiance. But the more she tried to remain in the background, the more people sought her. It was not that she wanted followers, but pain has a way of seeking out those who understand it, and soon she realized that she had become a symbol whether she wished it or not. One afternoon, while she was gathering herbs near the edge of the fields, she was approached by a young boy, no older than 12. He carried a bruise on his cheek, his eyes dark with a pain far too heavy for his age. He stood silently before her until she asked softly, "Who did this to you?" His lips trembled but he could not speak. Instead, he lifted his shirt slightly, revealing welts across his back, and the sight pierced her heart with the sharpness of memory. She knelt and placed her hands gently on his shoulders. "You are not weak," she told him, her voice steady. "You are not broken. These marks are not shame, they are proof that you endured." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he did not look away, and for the first time she saw in him the reflection of herself long ago, the same defiance hidden beneath pain. That night, as she sat alone with her lamp, she thought of the boy, of the women, of the whispers that followed her. She traced her fingers over the scars on her back, feeling the raised lines as if they were roads leading somewhere she had not yet traveled. She understood now that her suffering had not ended when she walked out of the soldier's prison. It had only changed form, becoming a bridge for others to cross. She realized too that the village headman would not stay silent forever. He would try to crush what had begun to grow around her. But for the first time in years she was not afraid. Her scars had been weapons once used against her, but now they had become shields, not only for herself but for those who had found courage in her survival. And as the night deepened, she whispered into the darkness, not as a prayer but as a promise, "I will not hide again." The days grew heavier with tension, as though the very air of the village had thickened. People still went about their routines, tending to crops, baking bread, repairing roofs, but beneath the surface there was a nervous current that could not be ignored. The headman's unease had begun to spread, and whispers against the simple woman returned, though this time they were sharpened with suspicion rather than mockery. Some claimed she was stirring rebellion among women, others said she sought to curse the village with her scars, and a few went so far as to say she was dangerous. Yet while these words circulated in dark corners, more and more people continued to seek her out. Those who had come to her once returned again, not because she gave them solutions, but because her presence steadied them, because she carried scars that made them feel less alone in their own pain. This quiet defiance unsettled those in power, and one evening the headman decided it was time to act. He called a gathering in the square, demanding that every household attend. The villagers came reluctantly, carrying their unease like stones in their chests. The headman stood tall, his voice sharp as he spoke of order, of tradition, of the dangers of allowing one person to disrupt the harmony of their lives. Without naming her directly at first, he painted her as a threat, a woman cursed by violence who carried shadows into their homes. He said that scars were marks of shame, signs of weakness, not strength, and that to follow such a person was to invite ruin. But as he spoke, the villagers shifted uncomfortably, remembering the day in the marketplace, remembering the silence that had fallen when her back had been revealed. His words clashed with what they had seen with their own eyes, and doubt rippled quietly through the crowd. Finally he spoke her name, his tone sharp with authority. He declared that she should leave the village, that her presence was poisoning their peace, and that if she did not go willingly they would drive her out. A murmur spread, low at first but rising, until voices from the crowd began to respond. One woman called out that it was not her presence but their cruelty that had been the poison. Another said that she had given them comfort when no one else did. The headman's face darkened, anger flashing in his eyes, but before he could silence them, a young boy stepped forward, the same boy who had shown her the marks on his back. His voice was trembling but strong enough for all to hear as he said, "She is not a curse. She saved me when no one else saw me." Gasps rippled through the square, and the boy's father, red with shame and fury, tried to pull him back, but the boy stood firm. The simple woman, who had remained at the edge of the gathering, silent and watchful, finally stepped forward. She did not raise her voice, yet every ear strained to hear her. She spoke slowly, her words measured but heavy with truth. "These scars you fear were not born of weakness," she said, turning slightly so the shawl slipped and the marks were faintly visible in the torchlight. "They were carved into me because I would not bow. I endured what should have killed me, and still I stand here among you. If that is shame, then let shame be stronger than pride." Her words fell like stones into a still pond, rippling through every heart that heard them. Some lowered their heads, unable to meet her gaze, while others straightened as though a hidden strength within them had been called forth. The headman tried to speak again, to reassert his control, but his voice faltered against the weight of her presence. The gathering ended in chaos, voices clashing, some defending her, others demanding her exile. But one thing was clear: the village was no longer united under the headman's authority. Lines had been drawn, not by her choice but by the truth of her survival. That night, her small home became a refuge again, filled with women who came to sit in silence, men who lingered outside afraid but listening, even children who simply wanted to feel the steadiness of her presence. She did not claim leadership, did not call for rebellion, yet it was clear to all that something had shifted irreversibly. The headman had tried to cast her out, but in doing so he had revealed his own fear, and fear is not strength. As the night deepened, she sat by the lamplight, her mind heavy with thoughts she could not ignore. She had not asked for this role, had not sought to become a symbol, yet fate had pressed it upon her. She remembered the old woman's words, "Use it." She thought of the young boy's trembling voice, of the mother clutching her baby, of the countless eyes that now looked to her with a mixture of hope and fear. The scars on her back ached with memory, but for the first time she felt they were not only hers, they belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had endured cruelty in shadows. And as she traced them with her fingers, she understood that her survival had become more than endurance. It had become a weapon, not of violence but of truth. When she finally lay down to rest, the night outside was still, yet she knew storms were coming. The headman would not accept his fading control quietly. He would strike again and harder. But she also knew something else. This time she would not face him alone. The following days carried a weight that pressed on every corner of the village. Conversations hushed when she passed, not in mockery as before but in tension, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. The headman had retreated into silence, yet his silence was not surrender, it was the quiet of a man plotting. She felt it like a shadow stretching across her doorstep, and though she carried on with her routine, gathering herbs, selling them in the market, listening to those who came to her door, she remained watchful. The women who visited her more frequently now whispered of men becoming restless, of tempers rising in households where control once went unquestioned. It was clear the headman's words had unsettled more than just authority. He had stirred fear, and fear often breeds violence. Still, she did not allow it to bend her resolve. She had endured storms far worse than a man's anger, and she would endure this one too. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in hues of fire, a group of men came to her house. Their faces were stern, their eyes wary, and she recognized among them two of the young men who had once humiliated her in the market. They stood at her door, shifting uneasily until one finally spoke. We were wrong," he admitted, his voice raw. What we did that day was cruel. But you must understand, the headman will not stop. He says you will destroy the village if you remain. She looked at them with calm eyes, her silence forcing them to continue. Another spoke more urgently. He plans to gather men to drag you out. He says the scars prove you are cursed, that you are not fit to live among us. For a moment, her chest tightened, not from fear but from the sharp familiarity of such cruelty. How many times had men used shame as a weapon? How many times had they sought to erase her through force? Yet even as the memories burned, she straightened, meeting their gaze. Then let him come, she said quietly. I have already faced worse than his threats. The men shifted, uncomfortable, but one of them lowered his head. We do not want to see harm come to you. We cannot undo what we did, but we can warn you. Leave now before it is too late. Her lips tightened, not in anger but in thought. She could have left, walked away into the wider world, carried her scars to some distant place where no one knew her name. But as she glanced at the small lamp glowing inside her home, at the women gathered there whispering softly, at the boy who now often lingered near her door as though guarding it, she knew leaving was no longer an option. Her life was no longer hers alone. If she fled, she would confirm the headman's words, and worse, she would abandon those who had begun to find strength in her presence. And so she shook her head slowly. I will not run. Tell him that if he wishes to face me, he knows where to find me. When the men left, their footsteps fading into the dark, she returned inside. The women looked at her with worry, but she offered them only calm silence. That night she slept little, her dreams restless with images of chains, of soldiers, of fire, but when dawn came she rose steady, her basket of herbs in hand. She went to the market as always, her steps firm, her eyes clear, daring anyone to challenge her. The people watched, tension thick in the air, but no one stopped her. By midday, however, word spread that the headman was gathering men in the square. Voices carried, loud and angry, declaring that she must be cast out before her presence brought ruin. The crowd swelled, and soon the sound of chanting reached even the far end of the fields. She stood at her stall, listening, the old fear curling faintly in her chest. But then she felt another presence beside her, the young boy, standing tall despite his small frame. Then another appeared, the young mother with her baby clutched to her chest. One by one, more of them gathered, the very people who had found solace in her presence, forming a quiet circle around her. None of them carried weapons, none shouted, but their silent unity was stronger than any noise in the square. She looked at them, her heart swelling with something she had not felt in years, belonging. For the first time she was not standing alone. The chanting from the square grew louder, and soon men appeared, led by the headman himself. His face was red with anger, his eyes sharp as knives as he pointed at her. There she is, he shouted. The curse among us. She poisons your minds with her scars. Drive her out. The men surged forward, but stopped short when they saw the crowd around her. Women, children, even a few men now stood firm, their bodies forming a wall between her and the mob. The headman barked orders, demanding they move aside, but no one flinched. The silence was heavy, stronger than his fury, and in that silence he faltered. She stepped forward, slipping her shawl from her shoulders just enough to reveal the scars that marked her back. The sight rippled through the crowd once again, silencing their chants. Her voice, calm but unyielding, cut through the air. You call these a curse. I call them survival. And survival is stronger than fear. If you wish to cast me out, then you must cast out everyone who has ever endured. Is that the village you want to build? Her words struck deep and the mob wavered. Some lowered their heads, shame burning in their faces. Others turned away, unable to meet her gaze. The headman shouted again, but this time fewer voices answered him. His authority, once unshakable, cracked before their eyes. She stood there, steady and unafraid, knowing that for the first time in her life, she was no longer just a simple woman. She had become something far greater, a living proof that survival itself was power. The standoff in the marketplace left the village trembling. Though no blood was spilled and no blows were exchanged, the air afterward felt heavy, as if everyone had witnessed something that shifted the ground beneath their feet. The headman's rage burned in his eyes as he stormed away, his men following but with hesitation in their steps, their confidence cracked. Those who had stood with her did not cheer or celebrate. They simply remained close, silent and firm, knowing the danger had not passed. She herself felt no triumph, only a deep weariness in her bones. Yet beneath that fatigue lay a flame she could not deny, a flame that told her she had stepped across a line from which there was no return. That night, her small home was fuller than it had ever been. Women, children, even a few men gathered there, speaking in hushed voices about what had happened. Some expressed fear that the headman would strike harder next time, others whispered that perhaps it was time to break free of his rule. She listened quietly, her eyes tracing the flicker of the oil lamp, knowing that words alone could not shield them. She also knew the headman would not let humiliation rest. Power clings tightly to those who fear losing it, and his pride had been wounded before the eyes of all. The following morning, as she stepped into the market, she noticed the tension was worse. People avoided eye contact, fearful of being seen on either side. Some women offered her quick nods of support, others stayed distant, worried about what association might cost them. The headman did not appear, but his absence was not comforting. It was the kind of silence that comes before storms. She sensed eyes watching her as she moved, not with ridicule as in the past, but with calculation, as though every movement she made was being weighed. And yet she walked calmly, her basket in hand, because she had already lived through storms far greater than whispers and stares. Still, deep inside she prepared herself, knowing that her scars alone would not shield her forever. 2 nights later the storm arrived. It was past midnight when fists pounded against her door, loud and furious. She rose quickly, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she opened it to find several men standing outside, torches blazing in their hands. Their faces were grim, their voices sharp as they ordered her to leave immediately, declaring that the headman had decreed her exile. Behind them shadows of others lingered, some watching, some silent, unsure. She did not flinch, did not retreat, but stood in the doorway, her figure outlined by the flickering light. "I will not leave," she said firmly. "This is my home." The men shouted, threatening to drag her out by force, but before they could step forward, voices rose from the darkness. Women began to appear, one by one, emerging from their houses, carrying nothing but the weight of their courage. Soon the boy stood there too, then the young mother with her baby, then more until a small crowd formed behind her. They did not carry weapons, but their presence was a shield stronger than any blade. The men hesitated, their torches casting long, uneasy shadows. One growled that the women were foolish, that they were standing against order, but none moved. The boy stepped forward again, his voice clear despite the fear in his eyes. "If you take her, you take us too." His words cut through the night like a blade, silencing even the men who had come with fury. They shifted uneasily, their strength faltering in the face of such quiet defiance. The simple woman stepped out then, standing not behind but among those who had gathered. She untied her shawl, letting it fall back once more to reveal her scars in the torchlight. Gasps echoed again, though many had seen them before. The sight never failed to pierce the heart. "You see these marks," she said, her voice steady. "They tried to erase me with pain, but I still stand. And now you try again with threats and exile. But I will tell you this, every scar you see is not mine alone. They belong to everyone here who has suffered and survived. You cannot silence us all." The men wavered, their anger dissolving into uncertainty. Some lowered their torches, others stepped back. The headman himself was not there, but his absence spoke volumes. He had sent others to do what he could not face himself. And as the crowd of villagers grew, more women stepping out, even a few men reluctantly joining, the balance shifted. The men who had come to exile her found themselves outnumbered, not in strength of arms but in strength of resolve. One by one they retreated, muttering under their breath, their torches flickering out as they disappeared into the darkness. The night grew quiet again, broken only by the sound of crickets and the soft breaths of those who remained. She stood there, scars bare, surrounded by the people who had chosen to stand with her, and for the first time in her life, she felt not like an outcast but like part of a whole. When the crowd finally dispersed, she returned inside, her body trembling with exhaustion. Yet her heart carried a strange calm. She knew the headman would not give up easily. His pride had been struck twice now, and he would grow desperate. But she also knew something had shifted permanently. The people had stood with her, not out of pity but out of recognition. They had claimed her scars as their own, and in doing so, they had broken the silence that bound them for so long. She sat by the lamp, tracing the ridges on her back with her fingertips, no longer feeling the sting of shame but the strength of survival. And as dawn crept over the horizon, she whispered to herself the truth she had long buried. She was no longer just a simple woman. They had tried to humiliate her, tried to break her, but in doing so, they had revealed her power. The morning after the confrontation, the village was eerily silent. People went about their chores, but their movements were slower, their eyes more watchful, as though they were waiting for something to happen. The headman had not shown himself, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he had gone to seek allies from neighboring villages, others whispered that he was planning to punish those who stood against him. Yet amid the uncertainty, a strange current of hope ran beneath the fear. The people had seen each other stand together for the first time, and that memory gave them courage. The simple woman who once moved like a shadow at the edges of their lives, now walked openly in the market, her scars no longer hidden. Wherever she passed, heads bowed in respect, not mockery. The children ran to her without hesitation, the women whispered words of gratitude, and even the men who had once jeered lowered their eyes in quiet acknowledgement. For the first time she felt the weight of belonging, not as a burden but as a gift. But power does not fade without struggle, and the headman returned 3 nights later, this time with more than words or threats. He arrived at the marketplace with a group of men from another village, armed with sticks and blades, their faces hard with cruelty. The villagers gathered quickly, drawn by the noise, fear tightening their chests. The headman shouted accusations, calling her a witch, a corrupter, a danger to tradition, his voice shrill with desperation. He demanded once more that she be cast out, declaring that anyone who stood with her was betraying their ancestors. The people trembled, for the armed men were many, and the headman's rage burned like fire. Yet before despair could take root, the simple woman stepped forward, her back straight, her voice calm. She said nothing at first, only untied her shawl once again and let the morning light reveal the marks carved into her flesh. A hush fell over the crowd, even the armed men staring as the scars glowed like ancient runes of survival. Then she spoke, her words ringing clear across the square. These scars are not curses, they are not shame. They are the truth written on my skin. The truth of cruelty, the truth of endurance, the truth of every hand that ever struck the weak. You call me dangerous, but I ask, dangerous to whom? To the tyrants who live on our fear? To the men who thrive on silence? Yes, I am dangerous to them because I will not bow. Her voice grew stronger, carrying on the wind. Look around you. How many of you carry scars unseen? How many of you bear pain hidden inside? I show mine so you may no longer feel alone. If you wish to drive me out, then strike me now. But know this, if I fall, others will rise, for the truth cannot be buried again. Her words lit something in the villagers that no weapon could extinguish. The women began to step forward, lifting their sleeves, pulling back their hair, showing bruises and scars of their own. One by one, voices rose, admitting the suffering they had endured in silence. The boy stood with them, shouting that her courage had given him strength. Soon the marketplace swelled with defiance, not violent but unyielding. The armed men looked around uneasily, their confidence faltering as the crowd grew louder. The headman's face twisted in fury, veins bulging as he screamed for his men to attack. But when they moved forward, they found themselves surrounded not by blades but by people who refused to scatter. Women, children, and men stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a wall of flesh and will. The men with weapons hesitated, for striking down unarmed villagers in broad daylight was not a battle they could win. Their leader barked orders, but fear crept into their eyes. The power of the headman's voice no longer reached them. The headman lunged forward himself, spitting rage, his arm raised to strike the woman. But before his hand could fall, it was caught by another, an elder of the village, stooped with age yet steady as stone. The elder looked at him with cold eyes and said, "Enough." The word echoed louder than the headman's screams. The villagers moved then, not to harm but to surround, forcing the headman back, his own men slipping away one by one until he stood alone. He raged, he cursed, he swore vengeance, but his power had crumbled. The people no longer feared him, and without their fear he was nothing. At last, beaten not by blows but by rejection, he fled the village, disappearing into the hills, his voice swallowed by the wind. The silence that followed was vast, heavy with disbelief. Slowly, the villagers turned to the woman, their eyes wide, their breaths unsteady. She did not stand like a conqueror, did not raise her arms in victory. She only lowered her shawl back over her shoulders, her face calm, her scars hidden once more. Yet everyone knew the marks were still there, carved into her skin, carved now into the memory of the entire village. The elder spoke softly, his voice trembling with reverence. "You are not a witch nor a danger. You are the proof of what we can endure, and the proof of what we can overcome." Others echoed his words, and soon the marketplace was filled with voices, not of mockery but of unity. In the days that followed, the village began to change. The old rules of silence broke apart, replaced by a fragile but growing courage. People spoke openly of their wounds, their struggles, their hopes. No longer did women lower their eyes when they passed men, no longer did children hide their bruises. The scars of the simple woman had become a mirror in which all could see themselves, and through that reflection they found strength. She did not seek to lead them, did not claim power, but her presence alone guided them, steady as the mountains. She tended her garden, taught the children, listened to the women, and walked with quiet dignity as she always had. Yet wherever she went, people followed, not because she demanded it, but because they believed in the truth she carried. Years later, when the story of the headman's fall was told, it was not told as a tale of violence or victory, but as the story of a woman who bore scars without shame. They remembered how she had stood against humiliation, how she had faced threats with calm, how she had turned pain into strength. They remembered how the marks on her back had stunned them, not because of their horror, but because of the power they revealed. And in every retelling, the simple woman became more than a figure of survival. She became a symbol of what it meant to rise from the ashes of cruelty and light a fire that no storm could extinguish. The end.